Hello everyone, and welcome back to another instalment of our long-running webinar series. Since we started our webinars in 2017, hundreds of experts have shared their knowledge on many different sustainability topics. Hearing from our experts and experienced guest speakers is a great way to build your sustainability knowledge and help your business succeed sustainably. We must urgently reduce carbon emissions from the built environment to meet our climate goals. This includes operational and embodied carbon. This webinar will cover what embodied carbon is and why it matters, why we need action on embodied carbon now, how to measure embodied carbon, and the role of rating systems in cutting down embodied carbon. A quick note before we start, some of the audio in the question and answer session at the end of this webinar is a little patchy, and we apologise for that. Let's get into it.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on measuring embodied carbon in the built environment. My name's Jeff Vickers and I'm the Technical Director at thinkstep-anz and pleased to be your host for today's 45-minute session. Normally we say it's insights from experts in 30 minutes, but today we've got an additional expert and so we've got 45 minutes. So thank you for your time and patience today and giving us an extra 15 minutes to get through all of the content. I wanted to just briefly introduce thinkstep-anz for those of you that don't know us. So we're a specialist sustainability advisory firm and our mission is to enable organizations to succeed sustainably. And we do that by working with organizations of all shapes and sizes to identify what matters to them, identify what matters most from a sustainability perspective and to try and help reduce emissions, improve the positive contributions they make in society and generally do things in a more sustainable way. I want to start today's session by talking about embodied carbon in Australasia and maybe setting some of the scenes, setting some of the groundwork and also give a little brief history lesson to where we've kind of come from and where we may be going to next. Then I'm going to be handing over to James Elks from NABERS and then finally Sam Archer from the New Zealand Green Building Council, and then we'll move on to our panel discussion. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, I think many of you probably are, but embodied carbon has been defined lots of different ways, but this is one way: the total greenhouse gas emissions and removals associated with materials and construction processes throughout the whole life cycle of an asset. So that's coming from the recent RICS Whole Life Carbon Assessment guidance. If you look at the life cycle of a building or of any asset, whether it's infrastructure or anything else, you typically can break it down into several stages. So the way the standards work typically is you have product-related emissions, which you're building construction products. You have the construction of the asset, you have the use of the asset, and then you have the end of life of the asset. And the embodied emissions are those that occur right at the start. They're the ones that are in the product and the construction. Those are your upfront emissions. There's also emissions associated with the maintenance and repair of the asset, which is your refurbishment, everything else. And then there's the emissions associated with the end of life, so demolition, deconstruction, recycling, landfill, incineration, whatever happens at the end of the life cycle of that asset. Embodied emissions are different to operational emissions in the sense that they're focused more on the materials and construction process. So we're not talking about energy use in buildings, we're not talking about water use in buildings, we're talking about the stuff that's related to the physical thing. Why would you care? Why are we worried about it? Well, there have been quite a few studies over the last few years that have shown that embodied emissions in the built environment are about 5 to 10% of annual emissions in both Australia and New Zealand. The importance of embodied emissions is that they're happening now and they're largely locked in. So when you build something, whether it's a new office tower or a bridge, a lot of the embodied carbon is locked in right from the start. Yes, there'll be more, over the life of the asset to maintain it and at the end, but a lot of that embodied carbon is really, really early on in the life cycle of the asset. In operational emissions, typically you're dispersing the emissions over a long period of time. Normally the asset would have a life of maybe 50 to 100 years. And so even though those operational emissions are significant, they're spread out and you've got the opportunity to decarbonize them in the future. With embodied carbon, and particularly the start of embodied carbon, which is called upfront carbon, you don't have that opportunity. You lock it in more or less from day one. Another important thing to keep in mind is that when we focus on operational emissions, we typically rely on decarbonization of the electricity grid to save us. So we're saying, hey, the grid's decarbonizing, that's fantastic, our emissions are going to go down. That is going to influence embodied carbon because some building products are electricity intensive, like aluminium or maybe recycled steel. But many others, like cement or other products, don't actually have a significant portion of electricity used to make them, and the emissions are coming from process heat and they're coming from direct chemical reactions. And as a result, it means that decarbonizing the grid, it's going to help, but it's not going to be the only thing we need to really get to a sort of net zero future. So I wanted to start in the past and kind of move forward. And I'm going to do this really, really quickly. I talk fast. I apologize in advance. My colleague Matthias, who's monitoring this session in the background, is going to post a whole bunch of links for you in case you miss some of the things I've said. But just to keep in mind that this session is being recorded. We will share a recording afterward. We will share the links later. If you need to, you can watch it at half speed if I'm talking too quickly later on, if you're really interested. And the links will be shared in case, you suffer from insomnia and need some light bedtime reading. So if we start way back when in the 1990s, there was early work on life cycle assessment of buildings. So there was lots of little disparate things happening in lots of parts of the world. People were trying to calculate what the impact of a building was, but they were doing it in lots of different ways, and it wasn't particularly comparable. In 2007, ISO published an international standard for what's called environmental product declarations of building products, and that standard sort of set the scene for how we calculate the impacts of a building product in a consistent way. But it wasn't until several years later that really kind of started to accelerate. So in 2010, we started to see the emergence of lots of different tools that are specific to building carbon footprinting. One popular example that many of you will know is the eTool tool, which was available for researchers in Australia from 2010. If we move forward to 2011, there was a well-known European standard published, which was published for building life cycle assessment specifically. And it had a sister standard, which was published in 2012, which was specific to environmental product declarations from buildings. So there was an ISO standard in 2007 that was significantly revised through a European standard in 2012. And the intent of the European standards is that the building life cycle assessment and the building product information would fit together seamlessly. So they're sister standards, and one is designed to feed into the other. And I think that's really what helped allow us to kind of catapult the amount of information that was available to be able to do a building LCA or an asset LCA for an infrastructure project. Because really, when you're looking at that sort of project, you really need to be able to sum up all the impacts of the individual parts to be able to get to the whole. And so by having the two things working together, that helped us to really kind of accelerate the uptake of this stuff. In 2013, in the New Zealand context, the Building Research Association of New Zealand brands start work on their long-term program on whole-of-life LCA in the New Zealand context, and subsequently built a whole bunch of tools. You had the Green Building Council of Australia run consultation between 2012 and 2014 on incorporating life cycle assessment into Green Star, and that also linked into the work that Sam and his group are doing at New Zealand Green Building Council about integration of life cycle assessment and environmental product declarations in green building. Brands, again, launched one of the major outputs from their research program, which was called LCA Quick, a freely available Excel-based calculator for building LCA in 2016. In 2018, we released a paper that was quantified maybe for the first time the embodied carbon in the built environment in New Zealand, which put it at 9% of New Zealand's emissions. In 2019, the World Green Building Council released a report called Bringing Embodied Carbon Upfront. And the reason why this report was so important is that before this, all of those standards that we had, they didn't define the word embodied carbon or the phrase embodied carbon. If you go look back at those early standards, the word embodied isn't even mentioned. And so it's really this later stuff where embodied carbon starts to be defined. And so one of the things that when you're looking at different definitions of embodied carbon, they aren't all the same. And the reason for that is that the early standards didn't actually define the term. They just said, here's the life cycle, we break it into modules, good luck to you. They didn't say this is embodied, this is operational, here's how we divide it. That's only really come a lot later. And one of the really important drivers for that was this report by the World Green Building Council. In 2020, the New Zealand Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, MB, started a public consultation on a scheme called Building for Climate Change. That scheme has two parts. One focuses on operational carbon, the other focuses on embodied carbon. And the intent is to encourage disclosure and then encourage reductions through different bands through time so that we collectively bring the carbon footprint of buildings down. In 2020 as well, the Green Building Council of Australia launched Green Star Buildings, and building on the work of the World Green Building Council, they introduced a credit for upfront carbon specifically. So while there was life cycle assessment before, the Green Star building tools specifically called out upfront carbon. In 2021, there were a whole host of reports that were published in Australia looking at quantifying embodied carbon in the Australian context, and they put it at various numbers between 4 and 10%. So there was one from the CEFC, there was one from the Low Carbon Living CRC, there was one from the Green Building Council and us. In 2021 as well, New Zealand Green Building Council launched their Homestar Embodied Carbon Calculator, which is a really simple tool for calculating the environmental footprint of residential houses in New Zealand. In 2022, NABERS released a consultation paper on embodied emissions and embodied carbon, which was the work of the previous year's sort of consultation work starting in 2021. In 2022 as well, the New South Wales government published its Sustainable Buildings State Environmental Planning Policy, and I apologise already for the acronym soup and all of these things, but basically there's the basics tool for residential. It was updated and expanded to include embodied emissions. There's the NABERS tool for non-residential, and disclosure was mandatory, or at least reporting was required from 2023 and expanding in 2024. In 2023, the New Zealand Rebuilding Council launched its Green Star Embodied Carbon Calculator, supporting calculator guide and methodology. And importantly, they provided that to NABERS for them to build on and extend. And one of the reasons we wanted to host this webinar today is to show the level of collaboration that's actually taking place, that we're not just in silos on both sides of the Tasman doing different things, or every state in Australia doing its own thing, that actually there's a considerable amount of integration that's happening behind the scenes to make sure we don't end up in different things. I think if the years 2020 to 2023 is the years of consultation, there were a huge number of consultations happening on embodied carbon through that time from lots of different organisations. We heard from quite a few people that you had consultation fatigue, so I apologise for that. But what I hope the outcome of all of that is that from 2024, which is where we are now, we're going to see some really great stuff coming out, and we're going to see lots more integration across Australia and New Zealand and sort of standardisation of this stuff. So in terms of what is coming for this year, we've got quantification of embodied carbon in Australia's built environment. It will be published by Infrastructure Australia. There's going to be embodied carbon measurement guidance for infrastructure, published and led by Infrastructure New South Wales. Green Star Buildings New Zealand will be published by the New Zealand Rebuilding Council, building on the Australian work. NABERS is looking to publish its embodied carbon rating tool. The GBCA will accept NABERS as a pathway for upfront carbon under Green Star, and ASBEC, the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, will release a proposed policy framework for managing embodied carbon in the Australian context. And so that's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of acronyms. I apologise. But I am really, really pleased today to have two of the organisations listed on this slide here today to talk more about this. And the first person I'm going to hand over is to James Elks, who's the wonderful person from NABERS who's going to talk us through everything that they are doing there. So I'm going to stop sharing and head over to James.
Thank you, Jeff. I am James Elks. I am the head of product development at NABERS, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're up to. But before we get to embodied carbon, I'm going to talk a little bit about NABERS and what we do, just a little bit, and then we'll get into embodied carbon. So at NABERS, we rate the sustainability of buildings on a 6-point scale, and we are Australia's largest building sustainability initiative with about 70 people. So in terms of our stars, 3-star is average, 6 stars is market leading, and 1 star is lots of room for improvement. And that's against a similar building. So maybe similar size, similar function. So it's a benchmark about your particular building, not a generic building. But what types of buildings? We're in 10 sectors or building types, covering everything from offices to residential aged care, cold stores to public hospitals. And we are on the cusp of launching a tool for schools, all of the 10,000 schools across Australia. And then soon after that, middle of this year, we're looking to launch a tool for retail stores. We certify buildings on energy, water, waste, indoor environment quality, and soon embodied carbon. And we're everywhere. This is the maps of buildings that have got current NABERS ratings, and for each of the CBDs across Australia, where you can see we're everywhere across Australia. We'll do about 7,000 ratings in 2024. So I want to just pick out a little case study, which is Australia Square, which is in Sydney. It's a big tall tower. It's got a circular bit on the top. You can go up and have a drink and sort of see all the way around the skyline. When they started rating with us in 2005, they got 0 stars. And this is a big, important premium building. They thought they were doing pretty well, but actually when they compared themselves, they weren't. And what we often say about 0 or low star rating buildings is there's lots of opportunity to improve without, major investment necessarily. And so I think in this case, they sort of looked at, air conditioning in the middle of the night, or, heating system, battling the cooling system, those types of optimizations before moving on to some of the larger stuff. And now they're one of the, more leading buildings in Sydney. And you can see by looking at their energy usage per meter squared, how much they reduced it. 65% reduction in energy intensity over a 15-year period, which is incredible. But this is cherry-picked example. If we look at all of the offices within our database, then we can get maybe a realer picture. What this graph is showing is when a building re-rates, or all of the buildings in our database re-rate over time, what happens? And what we see is that over a decade, they reduced their energy usage by about 33%, which is a very rapid rate of decarbonisation. We've seen the similar kind of thing in shopping centres. We've only got 8 years of data for that, but they're looking at nearly 40% reduction. Now, there's 3 actions that buildings need to take for Australia to reach net zero emissions. They are reduce energy usage, eliminate fossil fuels, aka electrify, and to reduce their embodied carbon. And they're different kind of things, because when you look at reducing energy usage, you can kind of chip away at that, like we saw with the GPT building before, Australia Square. You can do a little bit at a time and really improve your performance massively. But when it comes to embodied carbon, once that building is built, the emissions from building that building, they're in the atmosphere and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's important because buildings account for 38% of all energy-related emissions across the globe. It's a lot. And we can divide that into operational emissions, so heating, lighting, cooling, that kind of stuff, and embodied carbon, which is essentially constructing buildings for the most part. Now, right now, most emissions come from operations, but as buildings get more efficient, as the grid decarbonizes, we get more renewables into the grid, embodied carbon is going to become the major share of emissions from buildings. Already, it could be around 50%, kind of depends who you ask and how you do the modeling, but that's kind of where we're up to. So we've partnered with the Green Building Council of Australia, and we've been developing a national standard for embodied carbon since 2021. We've spoken to 300 plus organisations across Australia and some internationally. We've all the way from the decision makers, so the people are going to write checks and say, hey, we want low carbon buildings, to the people delivering those buildings, policy makers, and also the people delivering products that are going in those buildings, so the product manufacturer themselves. We've also flagged this with carbon neutral. We've been talking with the infrastructure bodies led by Infrastructure New South Wales, Infrastructure Australia, across Australia, to look at consistency and make sure that what we are doing is the same as what's happening elsewhere. So after speaking to a lot of people, what we heard is that we need to do something now. We need to do something fast to reduce embodied emissions. We can't stuff around. And secondly, we need to do the stuff that NABERS already does really well for operation, but we need to do that for embodied carbon. So one of those things is measurement. So we need to be able to measure a building really accurately. We need 2 different people to be able to measure the same emissions for the same building. And we also need that to be comparable. And that's what NABERS does really well at the moment. And so that's what we need to do for embodied carbon. Last year, we released a big consultation paper where we proposed 10 big things that we wanted to do. And what we heard back from that in the response was that, yes, most people were like, yep, absolutely, they're all the things that you need to do. But we did get lots of really interesting feedback in terms of how we need to implement measurement of embodied carbon. And I encourage you to have a look at the consultation response paper, because it does sort of summarize what people and what industry is thinking when it comes to embodied carbon measurement at the moment. So now I'm going to take you a little bit through what those proposals are, like what the tool is shaping up, and what it actually is. So it's going to focus on new buildings and major refurbishments. And that's because, there's not nearly as much you can do for a building that's a few decades old in terms of embodied carbon, as opposed to really considering embodied carbon at the design and build phase. We are going to capture emissions from the building materials themselves, the transport of those to site, and then the construction of the building. So that's also known as upfront carbon. And the reason, again, is that we can look back once a building is built and have a pretty good sense of what's been used and what emissions have gone up, and kind of agree on that. When we're looking forward into the future, it gets a lot harder, a lot more decisions need to be, or assumptions need to be made. A 50-year building or a 90-year building and all that sort of stuff. So Also, when we're looking at upfront carbon, you're capturing the great majority, over 80% of carbon anyway. We are going to encourage using products with known emissions. So how would you know how much carbon is coming out of your insulation or your steel? And the best way at the moment to know is to get an environmental product declaration for a particular product. Not all products have that though. So we will have a database of default conservative emissions. So, I don't have any data on my gyprock. Great, you can use the standard value, or go out and pick a product that has an environmental product declaration associated with it. And finally, we're going to introduce national benchmarks for comparing buildings of all types. So what that means is the stars. So once you've built a building and you've gone through all that hard work and you've designed something amazing and you've procured all these low carbon products, you can see that in a great star rating for your building. You can see a 4, 5, or 6 star rated building, something that's above average. In terms of everything else, so that's just a little touch on things that I think you might find interesting. The full scope of the standard is in the consultation paper. Again, we put a lot of effort into trying to make that reasonably accessible or easy to read. So I encourage you to have a look at that if you want more information. Now, I've talked a lot about the standard. But what actually is it? So it's 4 things. One is it's those default emissions factors. So if you don't have an EPD for a product, what's the default carbon value that you'll put in for that product? The second is the methodology. So imagine, do you include the landscaping on a building? Yes or no? Do you include floor coverings and finishing and lights and the carbon for all those things? So making sure that when people are measuring, they're measuring the same thing exactly. That's the methodology. And then the benchmark. So like I was talking about before, what's good, what's bad, what's ugly. And then the certification tool itself, which is just a way of actually taking all of the construction data for your building, essentially a list of the materials, how much steel, how much concrete, associated those with an emissions factor, and then getting your certification. Now, as we've done and seen in operational emission space, those 3 tools up the front, default emissions factors, methodology, and benchmarks, they'll be publicly and freely available for everyone to use. And what we will almost certainly see is those being embedded into other different, design tools and things like that. So as you're designing a building, you can keep an eye on where your NABERS rating or where your likely NABERS rating is actually sitting for that building once it's built. And in terms of 2024, which is March already, rapidly disappearing. Right now, what we are working on is data collection. So trying to figure out, get all the data in order so we can create the benchmarks. We are generating those default emissions factors. Then we'll get into benchmarking. Then we get into pilots and training and rules in the middle of the year. And then by the end of the year, we intend to launch fully fledged and ready to roll. So that's a big year for NABERS ahead. That's it for today. I've tried to keep it as light as possible. There's lots to talk about when it comes to embodied carbon. We love talking about it. We're really in the detail at the moment. So if you're interested, please encourage you to give me a call or email. Thanks so much.
And with that, I'd like to hand over to Sam Archer. So Sam's the Director of Market Transformation at the New Zealand Green Building Council. And he's going to talk to us today about the integration of upfront carbon and embodied carbon into Green Star.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and good afternoon to everyone. So I'm going to be talking through some of the work that New Zealand Green Building Council is doing in embodied emissions. I'm going to be focusing these slides on non-domestic buildings or commercial buildings. I ought to say we are also doing quite a lot of work around embodied emissions in residential buildings through our Home Start program, as Jeff said. But yeah, I'm going to focus on the commercial side of things. Okay. So we launched the current version of Green Star, version 1.1 of Design as Built in November 2022. And although we have been looking at life cycle studies and rewarding those in Green Star for quite a number of years, version 1.1 in 2022 was the first version in which we're making assessment of embodied emissions and upfront emissions compulsory. So now any projects registering with the New Zealand Green Building Council to do Green Star will have to do an embodied carbon assessment. I think as Jeff very helpfully showed with those timeline slides, it's taken all that time to sort of get to the point where the industry is comfortable generally, or at least the kind of, the leading edge of industry that would be doing Green Star is comfortable with doing these kind of assessments on every single project. But, the last couple of years, there's definitely been a massive learning curve and a massive kind of uptake now of consultants that are working with these embodied carbon tools, and that's really great to see. So the current requirements in Green Star are for 4-star a minimum of a 4 and star and 5-star a minimum of a 10% reduction against a reference building. So a standard sort of business as usual building, you have to be 10% better than that, and then for 6-star, 15% improvement in upfront emissions. That doesn't sound like a lot, 10 or 15%, but one of the things that we've been working in, and I don't want us to delve into the details of this, but when you're excluding the ability to include removals of carbon through carbon sequestration through timber, which is what we don't allow, then you're only allowed to show those emissions reductions through actual emissions, through actual reductions in carbon emissions, and those percentage improvements would get quite difficult. Although, as I'll come to talk about, as we develop the tool over the next 5, 6, 7 years, those carbon reductions that we're requiring are going to be tougher and harder than that as the industry responds to the initiative. Okay, so the current version of Green Star Design as built is really a stepping stone through to the next version of Green Star, which we're currently working on, which is Green Star Buildings. So for those of you who are in Australia, will know that Green Building Council of Australia have already launched and are now well into their Green Star Buildings program. NZGBC is a couple of years behind, but from the middle of this year we'll be launching Green Star Buildings, and that really cements and solidifies those requirements around buildings being in some way looking like they're on the journey to zero carbon in operation and embodied emissions. So, one of the things that we and GBCA have been focused very strongly on is that whatever requirements we put into the tool, that they're aligned with the Paris Agreement with 1.5 degrees of global warming. And in fact, we've just currently got a consultant doing a major study for us, looking at what reductions in operational and embodied emissions we would require in order to credibly say that a new building developed under Green Star would be consistent with the trajectories that we need to be on to meet our Paris Agreement targets. Again, in collaboration with GBCA, we've got this sort of 5-point definition of a building meeting that criteria, one being fossil fuel free. So under the new Green Star buildings will not be allowed to have any fossil fuel equivalent to gas boilers, including gas kitchens and so on. The building must be powered by renewables. And again, it's kind of interesting looking at hearing from the previous slides around Australia, where your grid's on a sort of rapid decarbonisation trajectory. New Zealand already has a very low carbon grid, so we're looking much more around electrification for that powered by renewables, i.e., provided you've got a grid connection and you're not using any fossil fuels in the building, then we consider that you're essentially powered by renewables. We need the building to be highly efficient. There's not an unlimited amount of renewable energy that we can build on the grid in New Zealand, and so we need to conserve energy as much as possible. And then finally, the last two, I'll go to the right. So offsets, there will be some carbon offsets initially particularly around embodied emissions, which are very difficult to get to zero. And then you've got this build with lower upfront emissions, and that's really the focus of the rest of my slides. Okay, so Jeff already mentioned the work that our building regulator, MB, is working on. So as he said, in 2020, they started talking about and publishing documents about the New Zealand Building Code requiring some form of assessment and then eventually capping of embodied emissions. So this was the publication that they released in 2020 around that. Ever since then, we've been sort of very closely engaged with MB, the regulator, to ensure that the standards that we're developing are very in keeping with the kind of thinking that they're developing around how the building consent system will deal with embodied emissions. I guess that's sort of building on the point that Jeff was making around all these kind of institutions like us, NABERS, GBCA and others, all trying to get consistency and agreement on the way in which we calculate these things, so that it's easy ultimately, we hope, for regulators to regulate, because the industry is already doing it in the way that they need these things to be calculated. I think that's really important. One of the things that we are probably maybe a little bit behind NABERS in Australia is this whole issue around how you show an improvement in your building. So we were just talking about this before the webinar started. NABERS in Australia is doing lots of work around developing, getting lots of information around hundreds of buildings and developing typical fixed targets. So you can say, well, typically a certain type of building, a warehouse or a school, might typically be around 400, 500 kilograms of carbon per square meter. And then you have to show that your building is less than that target. We can't currently do that in New Zealand because we don't have enough LCA studies of enough buildings to be able to confidently say a typical school would be X and a typical hospital would be Y. And so we and the GBCA actually in Australia currently have this two-model approach where you work out the embodied emissions of your proposed building and then compare that percentage reduction, how much better you are than a reference building. And that's a model of the same building essentially, but built with business as usual products and materials. And so, maybe you're using box standard typical concrete in the reference building, and then you're showing that because you're using a certain type of low carbon concrete, you can show the percentage reduction that you're achieving. We'd very much like to move to fixed targets at some point, and so would GBCA, and that's really a function of us developing enough LCA models of buildings so that we can confidently develop those benchmarks over the next few years. And again, our regulator MB has indicated that when they start capping emissions, they will move to a fixed target kind of approach. Okay, and then sort of building on that theme of standardizing things, I think it's fair to say, maybe it's a little bit unfair, but the whole kind of industry of embodied carbon emissions calculations has been a little bit Wild West for a long time, in the sense that, if you gave the same building to three consultants, you get three different answers. And that's not because those consultants are incompetent. It's because they're using different assumptions. They're using different data sets. They've included different things in the building. One consultant's included the lifts and the outside car park, and then the other consultant didn't include those things, for example. So it's really important for us all in New Zealand and in Australia to start coalescing around a standard way of calculating embodied emissions, so that when one building owner says, well, the embodied emissions for my building are 300 kilograms per square meter, and another one says mine are 200, that they're comparing apples with apples. Really, really important that we get that consistency. And again, that's the theme that Jeff is trying to get out through this through these presentations today, is that we are all working together. And so in that vein, as Jeff mentioned, in May 2023, we launched the Green Star NZ Embodied Carbon methodology, and that was very much building on and adding more detail and consistency to some of the other publications that we're seeing out there amongst these different organizations. The other thing that we have worked on is an embodied carbon emissions calculator. So that was built for us by ThinkStep. So that's at the moment just an Excel spreadsheet, a very sophisticated Excel spreadsheet, but one that I would say is relatively easy to use. That's downloadable for free from our website. And we're doing lots and lots of webinars and training around how to use this calculator, which those webinars have proved very, very popular. Again, this is not necessarily about NZGBC dominating the market for calculators for doing embodied emissions. It's more about around a transparent spreadsheet where you can clearly see what the data set looks like, what the scope is that we need you to be using, and so on, so that we're getting that consistency. Okay, so my last slide here. What are the key take-home messages that I want to communicate? It's really three needs is how I've built this. So the need for industry to unify around standards. I've already been talking about that. So the calculation methodology and the scope. So what are you including in the embodied emissions calculation? The need for standardized data. So we're having a lot of conversations now in New Zealand with brands, with MB and others around, is there a way in which we can collate all of that data, that material level data and EPDs and so on, and put that on an online resource, an online database that we can all then feed into, and then we've got a single source of truth for that data. That's essential that we get that off the ground, in my view. And then that need for building LCA data. So as I mentioned, it's really great that in Australia, NABERS is looking to do lots and lots of benchmarking work. We haven't done that in New Zealand. So one of the things that we're thinking about, the UK has already gone down this path, is providing an online web resource where once consultants have done an LCA for a building, they can then upload all the data and the metadata associated with that LCA assessment. And then over time, we get hundreds and hundreds of buildings on that online resource where people can then slice and dice the data and go, well, give me the average embodied emissions for the warehouse sector or the school sector, or the school sector in Auckland, and so on. So that's one thing that we really feel we need to be doing. Thank you very much. That's my last slide.
Thanks so much, Sam. So we'll open up to the questions, and there have been quite a few questions coming in, and James has been busily typing away, answering them furiously while you've been posting them. There's a few, though, that I did want to raise that I think are quite useful for both speakers. So David raised a question about, embodied carbon needing to be seen in the context of building less, more of a sufficiency mentality, and I guess asking how that can or should be considered in the context of this work, both in NABERS and in the NZGBC. So Sam, since you're currently unmuted, I wonder if you could maybe tackle that one first, then I'll hand to James.
Oh, look, I mean, the most sustainable building is the building you don't build, right? That's the cliche. I guess the challenge for an organisation like New Zealand Green Building Council or NABERS is that we rate buildings. So I mean, I'd be really interested to have a chat with the person who asked that question around what they think organisations like New Zealand Green Building Council can do to encourage sufficiency. I mean, I don't think sufficiency is a really noble idea. It's just how do we engage with that as green building councils or with regulators or so on. I don't have an answer to that really.
Yeah, it comes up all the time. The Australian Institute of Architects doing some really great work at the moment about no building, because you cannot build, and I mean, fabulous, really, from a carbon perspective. One thing that we are doing in the framework with was when it comes to reusing existing buildings. So often we pull down buildings, got parts of it great, maybe it's the core, the facade. They all sort of get chucked. But what we are doing is saying, if you use a bunch of bricks, like a facade for an existing building site, we'll kind of give you those free. You don't have to count those because they're really counted as part of the previous building's life cycle. So, but yes, it is a tricky problem, as Sam says, rating buildings, and so that's kind of where we're at. But certainly we work with others to try and minimize that as well.
Thank you. And there are also multiple people asking about fit out, and particularly fit out churn, and commenting that, fit out, a building, while it might last 50 to 100 years, the fit out's often changing every 7. I even saw one person posting 3.5 for retail, 3.5 year churn. That's terrifying, but I assume it is very true in retail and other environments and city centres. So I wondered, maybe James, I know you've got that included as part of the NABERS roadmap, if you could briefly talk to that.
Sorry, Jeff, I just missed that one. I was just reading the question. Sorry, can you repeat that one?
Just thinking about how fit out is potentially going to be dealt with under NABERS and in relation to embodied carbon. Can you talk about maybe the future thoughts there?
Yes, fit outs. Okay, so a couple of problems with fit outs. The biggest one at the moment is there's no data. So, there's lots of data on like concrete, steel, nuts. And so by the time you get down to a mouse or a table, a light fitting, plumbing, floor fixtures, there just isn't data. And so it's really difficult to actually measure because all you're just doing is, averages around. I guess it's the average for light fitting, plumbing, this, that, and the other. So one thing that needs to happen, we can get really detailed fit outs, is we need to see manufacturers getting environmental product declarations or measuring products. But it is a big problem because fit outs happen so often. And so certainly it's something that for us is the next priority after we launch the tool is looking at fit outs and where we should be playing in space, because that's all industry. It's really important.
Thanks, James. Do you have anything to add, Sam?
Yeah, I just had a quick point about that. Yeah, I was talking to GBCA only last Friday around the development of their interiors tool for Green Star. So Green Star Interiors, they're working on the next iteration of that. And as I understand it, it's quite interesting. You know, it's different metrics around what you measure in terms of. And I agree with James. You know, I think it's difficult doing the body assessments of fit out. So I think one of the, it's a real buzzword, isn't it? But one of the things I think GBCA is thinking about with fit outs as opposed to new buildings is that idea of circularity and how you reward that. As you say, when you've got that massive churn, you know, what are the ways in which we can start reusing or you know, extending the life of those fit out products and materials.
Fantastic. And I think from my perspective, one thing I'd add is just that from the perspective of the circular economy, I think you've got much greater opportunity to do something in fit out than you do in sort of base building. Because the problem is the lifetime of a base building at 50 to 100 years, you're beyond the life cycle of a company. So often, you know, the companies that produce the stuff won't be in business 100 years from now to take them back and reuse them. So that's where maybe material passports might help that allow anyone to pick it up. But, you know, in terms of business models around circularity, you know, fit out's a great space for that to work because the time horizons are so much more human scale, you know, and I think that's a really useful thing to think about. Now, go.
Make companies take back their products.
Yeah, exactly. You can force them to, and it's only 3.5 years. It's harder for 100. Since you're unmuted, Sam, we've got a very direct question from Taylor. What's the target release date for Green Star Buildings New Zealand?
I don't have an exact day, but it's the middle of the year, so I would say we'll be around July. Would be the target date for us to release it, and we'll give projects a year to keep registering under the old scheme, so it'll be middle of 2025 when we finally sort of turn off the old scheme and make people register on the Green Star buildings.
Fantastic. I'm conscious we're around about ad time. There are a few more questions here, so I'm still going to take a few more for those of you who want to stick around. For those of you who are needing to leave, feel free to drop off, and we'll circulate the video link afterward, and you can pick up any questions afterward if you want to. There's a question from David regarding simple methods of estimating embodied carbon at the planning approval stage so that you can compare with carbon budgets and be able to make improvements. One of the things that I just want to indicate is that the thing that I mentioned on screen that we published this year from Infrastructure New South Wales, it's a collaboration among all the different infrastructure bodies across Australia, the different states, and the intent is to produce embodied carbon guidance for infrastructure, including social infrastructure and including buildings. And so it will include, as an annex to that guidance, embodied carbon factors for 60 different classes of asset type, 30 buildings, 30 infrastructure, both in square meters of floor area for buildings and also dollar terms. So those are there. They're very high level. They're very rough and ready. You would not use them if you had any better data, but if you don't have any data at all, they're a good place to start at the planning approval stage. So that data will be available from Australia later this year. And hopefully that will help to answer that question. So watch the space. Going down through the list, there's a question related to the need for tools to be more integrated. So how can we bring together quantity surveying, LCA tools, embodied emissions in a single place? Does anyone want to kind of talk to that point? So the question is, what is the kind of state of the art in terms of software and being able to integrate this stuff together?
I don't really have that's getting slightly late. But what I do know is that there is some really clever stuff happening when it comes to measuring body carbon through things like fear. And that will just continue to grow is what we're seeing. But in terms of particular ones, this is people who are better qualified.
I don't have a very complete answer to that, albeit what I would say is I think there's a sort of emerging thinking that QSs are probably the right organisation to be leading on some of this work. I am aware, I've completely forgotten the name of the software, but there's a software that's being developed out of the South Island in New Zealand that has come out of a QS background where information is being fed into it, and that's producing the bills of quantities and so on for the QS, but also producing the embodied carbon data. So I completely agree with the kind of thrust of the question, which is those things should go hand in hand. And I think there are software developers out there that are starting to think about doing that.
So one you're thinking of actually, Sam, or is it a different one?
No, it's a different one.
Yeah, I know the other one. Yeah,
I don't monthly, but yeah.
Yeah, but so from my perspective, similar thing, right? You're starting to see a huge number of different software tools emerge that can take kind of CAD models, BIM data, and be able to just do, significant amounts of embodied carbon modeling directly with that data. The thing that I've found throughout my career is that people have been saying BIM integration for life cycle assessment for about 2 decades, and it really hasn't taken off. So it's been going and going and going for a long time, but the problem you always find is that everyone's structuring their models a bit differently. You've got different classification systems, even within the same company, and in the end, it becomes a real mess to kind of bring it all together. And some organizations have been more successful than others. And so it's one of those areas that's been the next big thing for about 2 decades. And only really in the last year or two have I seen some kind of really exciting tools that are looking to actually move that forward. There have been tools like the Tally app in the US for quite a long time that do that, but not really particularly well suited to our market.
Just on a very quick point, which is that I think all of us that have developed tools around this, we've developed a spreadsheet, but obviously there's e-tool and one-click and all the rest of it. I think we should be not too protective about the development of tools. Let's have a proliferation of tools. Who cares? We'll have hundreds of them, but the really important thing is that they're all using the same methodology and the same data sets and the same reporting. Otherwise, again, we're back into that kind of not being able to compare apples with apples.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll just do one or two more before we wrap up, just before I've got people on the line. There are questions regarding external works and landscaping and whether or not those are likely to be included. Some comments also around if you're landscaping with, soft landscaping and it's plants and trees and things, would the stored carbon in that be considered? How is that dealt with? Does either of you want to kind of comment on that?
You go. I'm happy to. So yeah, our current methodology excludes the external works, and the reason that we've done that is, again, if you're going to start moving to benchmarking, then really what we want to be doing is benchmarking the building, and not then the fact that one identical building has got 100 hectares of landscaping around it, as opposed to one that only has 2. So for us, it's a sort of benchmarking exercise around the building rather than the remainder of the infrastructure. On the question of soft landscaping and including the sequestration for that, we have specifically excluded sequestration from the targets that we put in Green Star for all sorts of reasons that we probably don't have time to go into here. So that wouldn't be included in the calculation currently.
Yeah, and there are some more questions related to that, which are about stored carbon in the building itself. Do you want to comment on that at all, Sam?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, look, this is a point of huge controversy and is a sort of really big topic. But that's probably a 2-hour webinar just by itself. But we have, after lots and lots of discussion and consultation and work, decided that we're not including the carbon removals. You put tons and tons of timber in a building. That timber is locking up carbon, and that gives that in one possibility that's giving a big negative number for various reasons, including the sort of perverse outcomes of giving you a sort of big get out of jail free card. For one of a quick sort of explanation, we're not allowing projects to do that. We want projects to focus on reducing the actual emissions as opposed to including the removals. And so that's where we put our focus. And so who knows where MB will go when they make it part of the building code, but that's where we've settled on for now.
Yes, and it's been the same. We'll make it transparent how much is stored in the building by identical carbon, but we're going to reverse out the emission by storing some carbon for 50 or 100 building. And same also with sand in terms of landscaping. It also gets really tricky when you're looking at precincts there, because you've got like maybe 3 or 4 buildings together, park, and then how do you locate the park? You start going down this real rabbit in your park, I presume. And realistically, what we talk about here is a very small carbon when you're comparing to the concrete and steel of the building. And so, to my earlier point about doing stuff that's right now and that we can do quickly, focusing on the big things, that's what we're keeping for now.
Wonderful. And on that very kind of controversial question that could take 2-hour webinar to explain, I think we'll wrap up there. I'd like to thank our speakers today, Sam Archer and James Elks, for their time. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. As indicated before, the webinar link will be circulated so you can watch the recording later if you missed anything. and we'll also circulate the links to all the content that was shared today. So thanks everyone for your time and have a great day. Bye.
We have many more webinars on our website on a whole host of sustainability topics. Visit us at thinkstep-anz.com.